In the cold, cloud-pierced skies above occupied France, the Luftwaffe ruled with ruthless confidence. Their sleek, agile Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf F-190s tore through Allied bombers like wolves in a sheepfold. They were fast, nimble, deadly, and they laughed when the Americans sent a new plane into the fight, the P-47 Thunderbolt. Fat, slow, clumsy, an oversized bulldog trying to chase panthers. German pilots mocked it, scoffing at the jug with arrogant grins. But within months, those laughs would turn to silence. Silence by the thunder of 8.50 caliber machine guns, by the shriek of diving fury, by the stubborn will of American pilots who refused to break, even as fire lit their cockpits and shrapnel tore through their wings. This is not just the story of a machine. It's the story of how ordinary young men, farm boys, mechanics, sons of miners and teachers, climbed into that steel beast and learned to fly into hell, and how a misunderstood, ridiculed aircraft became the symbol of resilience and raw power. A joke became a legend. This is the story of the Thunderbolt. By early 1943, the skies over Europe had turned hostile. The American bombing campaign was escalating, but every mission meant flying through a gauntlet of flak and fighter attacks. B-17 bombers, proud symbols of American industrial might, lumbered toward their targets with hope and heavy payloads, and more often than not came back shredded or didn't come back at all. The Luftwaffe, seasoned by years of air combat from the Blitzkrieg to the Battle of Britain, was relentless. German aces like Adolf Galland and Walter Nowotny picked off formations with surgical precision. The United States desperately needed a fighter that could escort bombers deep into enemy territory. A plane with long range, speed, and power. But what they had instead was something else. The Republic P-47. Thunderbolt was unlike anything the world had seen. It was massive, the heaviest single-engine fighter of the war. It looked almost ridiculous, like a flying oil drum with wings. At first glance, it was the opposite of what pilots wanted. Compared to the nimble Spitfires or sleek Mustangs, the P-47 was a brute. It wasn't quick to climb, it wasn't graceful, and to the untrained eye, it looked like it had no business in a dogfight. In Luftwaffe briefings, German pilots laughed. A flying bathtub, they said. Let them bring their pigs. But engineers at Republic Aviation, especially a man named Alexander Kartveli, had built this plane for something else. It wasn't meant to dance. It was meant to brawl. Deep inside its rugged frame beat the heart of a monster, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine that spat out 2,000 horsepower and screamed like thunder when it came alive. The plane was wrapped in armor plating, with thick steel around the cockpit and control systems. It could absorb punishment that would tear other fighters apart, and it carried something else. Something few fighters had in such devastating numbers. 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 on each wing, enough to shred through steel, flesh, and bone in a heartbeat. But firepower meant nothing if it couldn't reach the fight, and that's where the Thunderbolt failed. At first, its range was too short to escort bombers all the way into Germany and back. Pilots flew missions knowing they'd have to turn back too soon, leaving the bombers alone at the worst possible moment. German fighters waited for that moment, like sharks sensing blood in the water. They let the Thunderbolts go, then swooped in. Morale among bomber crews was collapsing. Some refused to fly. Others wrote their wills before takeoff. American command knew they were asking too much and giving too little. The Thunderbolt wasn't feared yet. It wasn't respected. It wasn't trusted. It needed to prove something. And the men who flew it knew that if they didn't figure out how to make it work, they'd keep watching their friends burn in the sky. And so a quiet desperation settled in among the pilots. They weren't legends yet. Most were barely out of their teens. Some had never flown combat before crossing the Atlantic. They were handed a machine others mocked and told to survive, told to protect, told to change the tide of the war. They didn't ask for glory, they asked for a fighting chance. And the P-47 slowly began to reveal its secrets. When German fighters tried to dive away, The Thunderbolt, with its heavy frame and powerful engine, could dive faster like a hammer falling from the heavens. It could hit terminal velocity and still keep control. The Germans would look back and see the Jug catching up, and too late realize they couldn't escape. And when the Thunderbolt's guns opened up, the air itself seemed to rip. The roar of 8 Brownings firing in unison was unlike anything the Luftwaffe had faced. Planes didn't just go due. By the summer of 1943, the sky had become a graveyard of ambition. Allied bombers still thundered toward targets deep inside the Reich, but the cost was unbearable. Entire squadrons vanished over places like Schweinfurt and Regensburg, where waves of German fighters ripped through the formations with ruthless precision. Each loss was a son, a brother, a husband swallowed by the unforgiving blue. Commanders begged for something to turn the tide, and in the shadows of hangars and briefing rooms, the Thunderbolt's moment was coming. New drop tanks, jettisonable fuel reservoirs hung beneath the wings, extended the P-47's reach. Suddenly, the Jug could go farther. Suddenly, it could stay longer. And with that came a new mission. No longer merely to escort the bombers, but to hunt, to sweep ahead, to clear the skies before the first bomb ever fell. No longer a bodyguard, the Thunderbolt became a blade. The first time they pushed deep into German territory with drop tanks, Luftwaffe radar operators picked up the unfamiliar echo. American fighters here? This far? They scrambled interceptors as they had done 100 times before. But this time, when the German fighters reached the skies, something was waiting for them. They expected slow bombers and vulnerable formations. What they found instead was a wall of lead moving at 400 miles per hour, and pilots who had tasted too much loss to ever hesitate again. The P-47 pilots didn't wait to be attacked. They dove, they flanked, they struck first. It was a violent, visceral awakening. The air was filled with shrieking engines, tracer fire, and the splintering of fuselages as 8.50 caliber guns tore through aircraft like paper. German pilots, who once laughed, now shouted warnings. Achtung! Achtung! Thunderbolts! The sneering tone was gone. In its place was urgency, fear. These weren't textbook dogfights. The P-47 didn't dance like a Spitfire or pirouette like a Messerschmitt. It didn't need to. Its dive speed made it a falling anvil. A thunderstrike from above German fighters tried to outturn it, but the Thunderbolt absorbed punishment that would kill other planes. Cannon shells thudded against its armored hide, but it kept flying. A pilot might see smoke rising from his wing, fluid leaking from a ruptured line, and still, he pulled up, kept climbing, returned fire. The plane became an extension of willpower, of raw resolve. The cockpit was hot, suffocating. Sweat mixed with fear, and the scent of gunpowder burned into the lungs. In those seconds of chaos, something changed. American pilots, once cautious, once doubted, became predators. Among them was Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, a name now etched in history. But back then, he was just another young man from Oklahoma, barely 20, flying in borrowed time. On one mission, after his P-47 was raked by cannon fire, Johnson lost control. Flames licked the instrument panel. The canopy was jammed. He was trapped, bleeding, dazed, choking, but not broken. He didn't bail because he couldn't. He didn't die because the Thunderbolt wouldn't let him. With half a wing missing and blood blurring his vision, Johnson flew that battered aircraft back to base. When ground crews saw the state of the plane, they didn't understand how it hadn't torn apart in midair. But the truth was simple. The Thunderbolt had taken the punishment so the man could live. The bond between pilot and machine was no longer mechanical. It was personal. The Germans began to adapt. They changed altitudes, changed tactics. They tried to avoid the Thunderbolts. But the American pilots, once reactive, now aggressive, were learning too. They coordinated sweeps ahead of the bombers, seeking out German airfields and strafing them mercilessly. They tore up runways, shot up parked planes, set fire to hangars. The P-47 became a scourge, a thunderous storm of fire that rained down without mercy. Where once they flew support, now they dominated. The psychological effect was devastating. Luftwaffe pilots began to crack. Some refused to engage Thunderbolts directly. They saw friends disappear under hails of gunfire. shredded before they could even return fire. The air war, once so one-sided, was now turning, and in this chaos, German command grew desperate. They accelerated jet fighter development. They tried new formations, but nothing could reverse the fact that the American fighters, once dismissed as inferior, had become a relentless force. The turning point came over the skies of Germany in early 1944. In one coordinated operation, P-47 squadrons launched a series of deep penetration sweeps. Diving into enemy airspace ahead of the bombers, German fighters rose to intercept, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Dozens were shot down in minutes. On the ground, radio operators screamed for reinforcements. Zu viele, too many. Entire Luftwaffe wings were wiped out before they even reached altitude. And when the bombers finally came into view, the skies were already silent. The P-47s had cleared the path. The mission succeeded with minimal loss. Something that had once seemed impossible, victory in the air, had become real. Back at base, pilots staggered from their cockpits, exhausted, scorched, deafened from the thunder of their own guns. Some limped away with smoke still curling from their engines. Others were carried out, burned but breathing. They didn't speak much. They didn't celebrate. They just looked at the holes in their wings, the oil on their boots, and the flags at half-mast for the ones who didn't return. The war was not won, but it was changing. And the men who flew the Thunderbolt knew they were no longer the underdogs. They were the storm. But still, the most terrifying missions were yet to come, when the P-47s would not just fight in the air, but descend to the ground, into the very heart of the Reich, where steel met fire and mercy had no place, where the line between man and machine would blur completely, and where legends would be forged in flame. Early 1944, the skies above Europe had begun to shift. The Luftwaffe, once so dominant, was bleeding F-47. Thunderbolts had earned their place in the clouds, no longer the subject of mockery, but of dread. Yet as the air war evolved, a new phase began, one where the enemy no longer waited in the sky, but hid among the forests, the factories, the convoys. And it was here, against tanks and trucks, trains and troops, that the P-47 would become something even more fearsome than a fighter. It would become a juggernaut, a machine of destruction that brought ruin from above, not just against enemy planes, but against the very arteries of the Nazi war machine. This was not dogfighting. This was not dueling at 20,000 feet. This was war at treetop level. War where one wrong move meant slamming into the earth. War where flak exploded like hell's own breath. And in this war, the Thunderbolt wasn't just effective, it was unmatched. The transformation began in the hedgerows of Normandy. After D-Day, the Wehrmacht poured reinforcements into France to stop the Allied advance. German convoys snaked through narrow roads, armored columns rolled toward the front, supply trains screeched across the countryside, but they didn't know what waited above the clouds. American pilots, often just hours removed from the beaches themselves, climbed into their Thunderbolts with new orders. Find the enemy on the ground, hit them hard, and don't come back empty. The first low-altitude missions were pure chaos. Flying at barely 100 feet, the Thunderbolt became a battering ram with wings of pilots skimmed over fields and villages, hugging the earth to avoid radar. Every flight meant threading a needle of death. Enemy flak batteries, machine gun nests, tree lines thick with camouflage. The smell of gunpowder and gasoline filled the cockpit before the first shot was even fired. Then, as targets appeared, columns of tanks, supply depots, rail yards, the Thunderbolt struck. It didn't just drop bombs. It screamed in, unleashed those 8.50 caliber guns, and left nothing standing. A single pass could rip through a half-dozen vehicles. Armored car burst into flame. Fuel trucks detonated like thunderclaps. German infantry scattered like ants under fire. And when bombs were added, 500-pounders slung under each wing, the results were apocalyptic. Rail lines crumpled. Bridges vanished. The sound of a P-47 div, engine screaming, wind howling, steel shrieking, became a death knell. Survivors spoke of it with reverence and fear. One German soldier later recalled, "When the jugs came, there was no fighting back. There was only running or dying. But the cost was enormous. These were not clean fights. There was no altitude, no room for error. Anti-aircraft fire exploded in waves. Some Thunderbolts never made it to their targets. Others disappeared in fireballs before they could pull up. The sky itself became lethal. Black puffs of flak tore through metal and flesh alike. And still they went back, again and again. Young men in their early 20s, some barely trained in ground attack tactics, turned themselves into human missiles. They flew low, flew hard, and flew straight into the teeth of hell. The carnage they inflicted was decisive. German logistics began to collapse. Tank units, unable to move by day, stalled. Ammunition dumps vanished. Reinforcements arrived too late, or not at all. The Luftwaffe, now grounded more often than not due to fuel shortages and Allied air superiority, could do little to stop it. The P-47 was no longer just a fighter. It had become an air-to-ground executioner, a weapon of attrition, and it did it all while absorbing damage no other plane could take. There are stories, impossible stories, and yet all true, of Thunderbolts returning with entire tail sections missing, holes large enough to crawl through, engines coughing their last breath. One aircraft was hit so badly its right wing dipped below the left on final approach, but the pilot, stubborn, half-blind from smoke, still brought it home. Ground crews would swarm the wreck, stunned. How did this stay in the air? But they'd say it again the next day. And the day after that, it wasn't just the machine. It was the men who flew it. Pilots like Captain Kenneth Mac MacDonald, who was hit twice on the same mission, but refused to turn back until he dropped his payload on a German armored column, or Lieutenant Oscar Perdomo, who late in the war would achieve ace-in-a-day status, downing 5 enemy aircraft in a single mission. These weren't supermen. They were sons of farmers, welders, teachers, ordinary men doing the impossible in a machine that had once been laughed at. But there was one mission, one that etched the Thunderbolt's legend in fire and steel. During the breakout from Normandy, a German panzer division attempted a counteroffensive. Allied armor was outnumbered. Ground troops were vulnerable. The situation was critical. Then, over the horizon came the sound. Deep, guttural engines. The scream of the Thunderbolt's dive. Dozens of P-47s swept in like a tempest. Within minutes, the counterattack was in ruins. More than 100 German vehicles were destroyed. Survivors stumbled from the wreckage in shock. The road was littered with burning tanks, twisted metal, and silence. The battle had lasted less than half an hour. The Allies didn't just survive, they advanced. And yet, for all their rare fury, all their destruction, the men who flew the Thunderbolt never saw themselves as invincible. Each mission, they wrote letters home, goodbye letters, just in case they folded pictures of sweethearts into their flight suits. They sat in silence before dawn launches, staring at the floor, knowing they might not see the sunset, but they went anyway. Not because they were fearless, but because they knew what was at stake. The longer the war dragged on, the more every mission counted, and so they kept flying. Through fire, through flak, through fear. And as the war turned, as Germany faltered, as Allied forces pushed east, the P-47 remained ever at the front, escorting, strafing, bombing, returning home blackened but alive. But its final test would come not in the fields of France or the skies of Germany, but in the fading hours of a war nearly won, a last stand, a final storm, a legacy sealed in the thunder it was named for. As the winter of 1944 gripped Europe in ice and silence, the war entered its most brutal, desperate phase. Hitler's Reich was cornered, but not yet broken. In the West, Allied forces prepared for the final push into Germany, unaware that the Nazis were assembling one last gamble, a winter offensive meant to split the Allied lines and force a negotiated peace. It would be called the Battle of the Bulge, and in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, it would become one of the most savage battles of the war. But even before the tanks rolled and the infantry charged, something stirred above the clouds. The P-47 Thunderbolts, battle-hardened, fire-scarred, and trusted now by the very men who once doubted them, would face their final and greatest test. Because in this last storm of war, when the enemy came with everything they had left, the skies once again became a crucible. And the Thunderbolt, old, rugged, loud, would thunder once more. The offensive began under a veil of snow and fog. The Germans knew the weather was their ally. If the skies were closed, the Allied air forces, their greatest advantage, would be grounded. For the first 2 days, that gamble paid off. American and British units were caught off guard, isolated, surrounded. The German spearhead, led by armored divisions and SS troops, surged forward like a black tide. Roads were choked with refugees and shattered tanks. The front was collapsing. In those first days, there were no thunderbolts in the sky. No comforting roar overhead. The silence was suffocating. But on the third day, the clouds parted. Not fully, not gently. Just enough. Just a window, and the thunderbolts came. They came in waves, engines roaring like ancient gods awakening from slumber. Pilots launched before dawn, sometimes through snow still clinging to the wings. They flew low, under the radar, under the clouds, hugging the frozen treetops. Frost bit at their faces, guns iced over mid-flight, but they kept coming because they knew what waited below. Thousands of Allied soldiers, trapped in Bastogne, surrounded, cut off. They needed air support, or they would be buried in that forest. And with them, the momentum of the war. The P-47 pilots had seen combat before, but nothing like this. The Ardennes was no open battlefield. It was trees, endless trees, hills and valleys and blind corners. Every target was hidden. Every shot came without warning. And the cold was merciless. Oil froze in gun lines, canopies stuck. One mistake, one moment of hesitation meant slamming into a snow-covered tree at 400 miles an hour. And yet, they flew. And what they brought with them was fury. Thunderbolts struck German supply lines first. Convoys snaking through narrow forest roads suddenly erupted into firestorms. Trucks turned to molten steel. Horses reared and scattered. The earth itself seemed to burn. Then came the tanks. Panther and Tiger tanks, feared juggernauts. Targeted from above, Thunderbolt pilots dove vertically, released bombs at impossible angles, then strafed the wreckage to finish the job. German commanders were forced to halt movement during daylight. Even the SS couldn't push forward when their tanks were burning before they reached the front. In one 48-hour period, P-47s flew over 1,000 sorties. They destroyed hundreds of vehicles. They turned the offensive's momentum to ash. But it wasn't without cost. Flak guns waited everywhere. Hidden in barns, in churches, in the woods, pilots saw the sky bloom in black and red, each puff a coin flip between survival and fire. Some P-47s went down trailing smoke, spinning toward the earth like wounded hawks. Some pilots bailed out, only to be captured, or worse. Others rode their dying machines into final attack runs, knowing they wouldn't make it home. One was Captain William "Red" Carmichael. His plane took a direct hit near St. Vith, rupturing his fuel line. Smoke filled the cockpit, fire licking at his legs. But he didn't turn back. He dove into a German column, dropped his bombs, and strafed the survivors before bailing out over friendly lines. He survived. Barely. His Thunderbolt did not. But it had done its job. Every mission was a brutal arithmetic. How many men on the ground might live if we succeed? And how many might die if we fail? The pilots felt that weight. They felt it in the radio calls from trapped infantry, begging for air support. They felt it in the silence that followed a wingman's final scream. And they felt it in the way the Thunderbolt responded, groaning under the strain, shaking from the flak, but always coming home. If it could, it was during these days, more than any other, that the Thunderbolt's legacy was sealed. Not by the records it set, but by the men who climbed into its cockpit knowing that winter might be the last thing they ever saw. It was no longer a joke, no longer a question. It was the answer, the hammer in America's fist, the storm that broke the enemy. By the end of the Battle of the Bulge, the German advance had stalled. Their supplies were gone. Their tanks were wrecked. Their best units were decimated. And the skies, once again, belonged to the Allies. General Eisenhower later credited air power as one of the decisive factors in the battle, and among those air units, none had flown more sorties or inflicted more damage than the P-47 groups. From beginning to end, the Thunderbolt had been there, loud, brutal, unrelenting. And then the war began to end. Germany retreated, the Reich collapsed. In May 1945, the guns finally fell silent. The pilots, those who survived, flew home. Some limped back on ruined legs. Some bore scars they'd carry for life. Many never spoke of what they saw. Others told stories with haunted eyes. The Thunderbolts were decommissioned, replaced by newer aircraft, faster jets, sleeker machines. The world moved on, but in quiet hangars and dusty airfields, a few jugs remained. Their wings still bore the holes. Their fuselages still carried the soot. And those who knew never forgot. Because the P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't supposed to succeed, it wasn't supposed to turn the tide. It wasn't sleek. It wasn't elegant. It was raw, unapologetic. It was fire and steel and stubborn will. And in the darkest winter of the war, when hope was almost lost, it was the thunder that answered. When the last bombs fell and the echoes of war began to fade across Europe, the world turned its gaze toward rebuilding cities once cloaked in smoke and flame began to breathe again. The skies, once torn by machine guns and metal, turned blue and silent. But scattered across the airfields of England, France, and the liberated Low Countries, there sat the machines that had helped win that silence, forgotten by many, revered by few. Among them, lined up like aging warriors, were the Thunderbolts paint-chipped, engines quiet, wings still bearing the grime of battle. They had no more missions, no more convoys to strafe, no more comrades to protect. But the stories they carried, etched in bullet scars, oil stains, and blackened steel, would never vanish. Because their legacy was never just about what they destroyed, it was about what they saved. The P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't a symbol of elegance or fame. It never had the sleek allure of the Mustang or the romantic aura of the Spitfire. It was not the darling of Hollywood. It was not the first choice. In many ways, it began as a mistake. A machine too heavy, too slow, too odd-looking to belong in the sky. But what it became was a testament to the human spirit, to resilience, to the refusal to surrender when the world laughs at you. Every bolt in its fuselage, every rivet, every pound of armor told a story of defiance, not just against an enemy, but against expectation itself. For the pilots, the Thunderbolt became more than a plane. It became a companion, a shield, a symbol of a second chance when odds said they wouldn't make it home. Some spoke of it with reverence, others with gratitude, and all with awe. It took hits that would have killed other aircraft. It brought them home on one engine, with half a wing, with the landing gear stuck and the fuel line slashed. And through it all, it gave them the will to dive one more time, fire one more burst, complete one more mission. Not because they wanted glory, but because someone on the ground was counting on them to show up. In the final months of the war, as the Luftwaffe crumbled and Allied tanks rolled into Berlin, the role of the Thunderbolt began to fade. Its dominance as a ground attack monster had changed the shape of the front roads, trains, and bridges destroyed by its bombs remained lifeless arteries in the Nazi war machine. But newer jets and faster planes were already waiting in the wings. Technology had moved on. The P-47's days of glory were over. Many were scrapped. Others sold to foreign and air forces. A few found homes in museums or private collections, but most were dismantled, their metal melted, their guns disarmed, their stories almost forgotten. Almost. Because among those who knew, those who fought, and those who lived because the P-47 showed up, the memory never faded. Veterans carried pieces of it in their hearts, in their dreams. They remembered the vibration of the engine under their boots, the way the sun gleamed off the wings at altitude, the weight of the control stick when banking into a dive, the deafening roar of 8.50 calibers screaming to life, and more than anything, the feeling after every mission of stepping onto the tarmac with black smoke behind them and blood in the clouds, knowing they had survived one more day because that machine had refused to die today. Historians speak of the P-47 in numbers. Over 15,000 produced, more than 500,000 combat sorties flown. Hundreds of thousands of tons of ordnance dropped, thousands of enemy vehicles, trains, planes, and fortifications destroyed. But those numbers can never fully express the human truth behind the jug, because the true legacy of the Thunderbolt is not what it did, it's what it represented. It was proof that what matters in war and in life is not flash or fame, it's heart, grit, the ability to stand your ground when others expect you to fall. The German aces stopped laughing, not because the P-47 grew faster or prettier, but because it grew fearless. And that fearlessness was born not in laboratories or design boards, but in the hands of men who dared to trust the unproven, who dared to strap themselves into a flying anvil and go to war with fire and steel. And perhaps that is the greatest truth the Thunderbolt offers us. In a world obsessed with perfection, it reminds us that greatness often comes from imperfection, that sometimes the most underestimated, the most ridiculed, the most unlikely become the ones who turn the tide. It tells us that power doesn't have to be sleek, that endurance matters more than elegance, that thunder, when harnessed with courage, can shatter any storm. The P-47 Thunderbolt was never supposed to be the hero, but history doesn't ask for permission. It remembers who showed up and who didn't run. Time has worn away the edges of memory. The wars that once tore the world apart are now black and white footage in documentaries, pages in textbooks, faded photographs in dusty frames. The men who flew the Thunderbolt, the ones who crawled into that cockpit with trembling hands and steady hearts, are mostly gone now. Their voices grow faint, their names remembered in monuments and memoirs, their stories carried by their children and grandchildren. But if you stand beside a restored P-47 today, under an open sky, and place your hand against its steel flank, you can still feel it. The hum of something greater, the echo of fire and fury, yes, but also of resilience, of grit, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the most unforgiving crucible on Earth. Because the legacy of the Thunderbolt is not just found in the missions it flew, or the enemies it destroyed, or the battles it helped win. Its true legacy lives in what it teaches us, now decades later, about what it means to stand your ground, to adapt, and to rise when the world calls you a mistake. The P-47 was never the perfect machine. It was heavy. It was clumsy at low speeds. It wasn't beautiful. It didn't glide through the clouds like an artist's sketch. It thundered through them, its engine a defiant roar against silence, its body a battering ram against the enemy's will. And maybe that's why it worked, because it matched the men who flew it. They weren't born for war. They didn't seek medals or monuments. They were farm boys from Kansas, mechanics from Detroit, clerks from Brooklyn. They hadn't trained for glory. They trained to survive and to protect the ones who couldn't fly. Their courage wasn't loud. It was silent, smoldering, the kind that strapped itself into a machine everyone else dismissed and made it legendary. These men didn't just fight the enemy. They fought fear. They fought doubt. And they did it in the cockpit of a plane that, on paper, shouldn't have been what it became. And that is the miracle of the Thunderbolt. That it was built not as a weapon of elegance, but of endurance. Not to impress, but to outlast. It gave the Allies time to regroup, time to strike back, time to believe that victory wasn't impossible. It gave cover to the bombers, destroyed the enemy's lifelines, shielded the infantry crawling through mud and mortar fire. It was the reason some parents saw their sons again, the reason some soldiers on the ground saw the next sunrise. And though it was born of engineering, what gave it its power wasn't just its radial engine or its 850 caliber guns. It was the soul poured into it by those who flew and maintained it, who patched its wings with trembling hands, who believed in it even when no one else did. In the end, the Thunderbolt represents something larger than war. It represents resilience in the face of ridicule. It reminds us that success is not always born of perfection, but of persistence. That what others call a flaw might become your greatest strength if you refuse to quit. That courage isn't always flashy. Sometimes it's as simple as climbing into the cockpit again and again when you don't know if you'll come back. It's knowing your machine isn't perfect, but still choosing to trust it, still choosing to fight. In every shattered village the P-47 helped liberate, in every road it cleared, in every bomber it escorted home, it left more than just scorched earth and twisted wreckage. It left a legacy of belief that even in the worst of times, with imperfect tools and impossible odds, people can rise, they can endure, they can fight like thunder and win. That's what the German pilots didn't see when they first laughed at the Thunderbolt. They saw an overweight, awkward machine. They didn't see the will behind the steel. the unshakable resolve of a nation's youth determined to do their part. They didn't see the quiet defiance of engineers who built something unorthodox and refused to apologize for it. They didn't see the heroism stitched into every flight suit or the tearful goodbyes spoken in silence at airfields before every mission. But they learned, because when the skies darkened and the wind began to scream, it was not laughter they heard. It was the roar of the Thunderbolt. And behind that roar, a promise. We're coming, and we won't stop until it's over. Let that be what we remember. Not just the battles, not just the bombs, but the bravery, the stubbornness, the thunder in the hearts of ordinary men who made history in a machine that refused to be forgotten. Even now, when you see a P-47 on static display, with faded paint and weary wings, know this: it may be silent, but inside the echo still lives, the echo of thunder, the echo of heroes. Though the war ended and the guns fell silent, the Thunderbolt story did not end with peace treaties or surrender parades. Its final chapter wasn't written on the battlefield, but in the decades that followed, in the hangars of quiet museums, in the trembling hands of veterans who walked alongside restored warbirds at air shows, in the wide eyes of grandchildren staring up at a machine their grandfather once flew into hell and back. The P-47 never became a fixture of Cold War arsenals. It never saw service in modern jet battles. Yet somehow, long after its final combat mission, it remained alive, not as a weapon, but as a whisper, a symbol, a relic of a time when the fate of the world was written in exhaust smoke and gunfire. And it continued to speak to us long after its engine cooled, telling a story not only of war, but of endurance, of pride, of what it means to matter when no one expects you to. In the years after 1945, as nations rebuilt and moved on, many of the great warbirds were retired. The Mustang found fame in Korea. The Spitfire became a cultural icon. But the P-47, it quietly faded, slipping into the background, just as it had arrived. Never flashy, never the showpiece. And yet it endured foreign air forces, like those of Brazil, Mexico, and even post-war France, adopted the Thunderbolt, flying it well into the 1950s. In remote airfields across South America, the Jug still flew, its engine roaring like an echo of an earlier time. In some cases, it was flown by young pilots who had only heard legends of its indestructibility, and then came to believe it them the moment they felt how it absorbed recoil from those heavy guns or shrugged off turbulence with the brute weight of its frame. For these nations, the P-47 was more than surplus. It was a guardian. But it wasn't just in the air that the Thunderbolt story lingered. It was in the broken voices of veterans who returned to the aircraft decades later. Men who in their youth had once climbed into its cockpit with trembling fingers now stood with onges and silver hair, gazing at the machines that had once carried them through storms of flak and fire. And when they spoke, their words were often few, but their silence spoke volumes. They ran their hands across the patched bullet holes. They remembered the scream of the engine, the smell of oil and sweat, and they remembered the faces of those who never returned, the wingmen lost in sudden fireballs, the ones who disappeared into clouds and never came out. For these men, the Thunderbolt was not a war machine. It was a tombstone and a memorial. And a friend. In the United States, a few Jugs were preserved, restored to flying condition, by dedicated teams of mechanics and historians who understood what they were preserving. These aircraft became symbols not of death, but of life. They flew in commemorative formations over Arlington. They performed in air shows, engines thundering as they had in 1944, as crowds looked skyward in awe. And in that moment, as children covered their ears and veterans wiped their eyes, the legacy of the P-47 became more than history. It became inheritance, a passing of flame, a reminder that courage is not extinct, that what was once done can still be done again if the spirit endures. Schools began to teach about the war in broader strokes, nations, treaties, alliances. But for those who cared to dig deeper, the Thunderbolt story was still there. In memoirs like those of Robert S. Johnson, who described being pursued by a Focke-Wulf only to escape, not because of skill, but because of the Jug's brutal survivability. In the worn journals of crew chiefs who described patching holes through fuel lines with chewing gum and hope. in the testimony of bomber crews who looked out their windows, certain they would die, only to see a single P-47 rise out of the clouds, guns blazing, driving the enemy away like a guardian angel carved from iron. Its cultural legacy rippled further. Artists painted it not as a sleek predator, but as a beast of burden. Novels and films, when they dared to feature the Thunderbolt, portrayed it not as romantic, but as real, as ugly and unstoppable and undeniably brave. And in that realism, it found power, because the world didn't need more fairy tales. It needed truth, and the truth was that wars aren't won by perfect machines or flawless men. They are won by those who persist, who keep going, who survive, not by chance, but by choice. And so the Thunderbolt began to symbolize something deeper, not just in aviation, but in life. It became the aircraft of the underdog, the underestimated, the unwanted. It inspired engineers and pilots, artists and thinkers, people who saw in it a reflection of themselves. It was a machine that had been doubted from the beginning, a machine no one believed in, until it changed the course of the war. And in a world full of skeptics and cynics, that story mattered. Because it wasn't just about warplanes, it was about becoming more than what you're told you are. To this day, you'll find restored Thunderbolts in museums and private hangars, sometimes in silence, sometimes roaring to life on special days. When they fly, it is not for glory. It is for memory, for legacy, for the idea that even in a world of fast-paced innovation, the spirit of something rugged, flawed, and determined still matters. Children press their hands to the glass as it taxis past. Veterans salute with trembling arms. And if you listen closely, not with your ears, but with your heart, you can hear it, the thunder. Not of guns or bombs or engines, but of resolve, of a machine and a generation that was told it wasn't enough and proved the world wrong. In a world racing forward, where the future is measured in nanoseconds and dreams are printed in code and carbon fiber, the roar of the P-47 Thunderbolt seems like an echo from another era, a relic of piston engines and propellers, of black and white photographs and long-vanished battlefields. And yet, its story remains deeply relevant, not as a tale of war, but as a testament to human character. In the enduring frame of the Thunderbolt lies a quiet but urgent message, that the true battles of life are not always won by those who appear the fastest, the sleekest, or the most celebrated. They are won by those who endure, who adapt, who rise again and again, no matter how many times they're told they shouldn't. The P-47 Thunderbolt began its journey as a compromise. It was not the dream plane of engineers. It was born from desperation, forged under pressure, designed not to be perfect, but to survive. It didn't match the elegance of a Mustang or the agility of a Spitfire. Its wings were thick, its frame bulky, its silhouette almost laughable by fighter pilot standards. But where others cracked under pressure, the jug held together. Where others turned back, it pressed forward. It carried bomb loads that defied physics. It soaked up punishment that should have torn it apart. And above all, it carried within its frame the lives and hopes of thousands of young men who asked for one simple thing: bring me home. And that's why its legacy endures. Because we live in a time that often mistakes flash for strength, style for substance. The P-47 teaches us something ancient and urgent, that the ability to endure, to take a hit and keep flying, to be doubted and still rise, is the foundation of real power. It reminds us that resilience isn't glamorous. It's hard, it's loud, it's dirty, it's filled with fear and failure, and the kind of strength that doesn't get medals, only scars. But it also reminds us that these scars are what change the world. Look around today and you'll see Thunderbolts everywhere, not with wings or guns, but in people who refuse to give up, the single mother working 2 jobs to feed her children, the young engineer dismissed by her peers, building something no one else believes in, the soldier returning from war, carrying the invisible wounds of trauma and guilt, yet still standing, the teacher in a crumbling school, the medic in a war zone, the firefighter who runs into flames while others run out. These are the jugs of our time, heavy, scarred, determined, built not for show, but for survival. And just like the P-47, They are often overlooked until the moment they are needed. Until the moment that the world is on fire and they thunder in, not for glory, but because someone must. The P-47's final mission, then, is not one of war. It's a mission of memory, of meaning. It calls to us across time and says, be strong in the storm. Be dependable when others falter. Carry the weight without complaint. Fight with what you have, not with what you wish you had. In an age where everyone wants to shine, the Thunderbolt reminds us to endure, to protect, to persevere. It reminds us that sometimes the real hero doesn't arrive like a knight on a stallion. Sometimes he arrives in a noisy, battered, mud-splattered aircraft with oil on his boots and fear in his eyes, and still chooses to fly into the fire because someone on the ground is counting on him, because the mission matters more than the fear, because being underestimated is not a weakness. It's an invitation to prove the world wrong. That's the final truth of the Thunderbolt. Not that it flew faster, or fired harder, or soared higher, but that it never quit. And in that refusal to break, it inspired a generation to do the same. So the next time you see an old warbird at rest, silent, wings folded, listen closely. You may just hear the whisper of thunder, and in that whisper, the voice of a legacy that refuses to die. Beyond the roar of engines and the blaze of gunfire, beneath the stories of sorties and kills, there lies a quieter truth, one often overshadowed by statistics and glorified dogfights. The truth is this: the P-47 Thunderbolt was never just a machine of war. It was a vessel for something far more complex, far more fragile, the human spirit. Underneath the armored canopy, surrounded by fuel lines and belts of ammunition, sat a boy, often just 19 or 20, who had never known the taste of battle before strapping himself into a cockpit of fire. These were not hardened warriors forged by years of combat. They were students, farmers, garage mechanics, sons from small towns whose lives had been torn away from stillness and thrown into history. And it was through their trembling hands that the Thunderbolt became more than steel. It became soul. They didn't fly the Jug because it was glorious. They flew it because they had no choice. They flew it because the world had reached a point where evil could only be pushed back by ordinary men doing unthinkable things. And yet, within those cockpits, something extraordinary happened. Those young pilots, isolated, terrified, uncertain, fused with the machine in a union of pure will. It was a relationship not of admiration, but of raw need. They needed the Jug to carry them through the flak bursts and tracers. And in turn, the Jug needed someone willing to trust his brute strength and limitations. There was no romance in that exchange, only necessity. And yet, it was beautiful. Each mission began not with heroism, but with fear. The kind of fear that makes your hands sweat as you climb into the cockpit, that wraps around your throat as you check your gauges one last time, the kind that makes your heart ache as you glance at the photo tucked near the control panel, a wife, a child, a mother, knowing it may be the last time you see that smile. The engines would fire, the squadron would roll out in formation, and once airborne, there was no more time for doubt, only action, only focus. But even at 20,000 feet, even in the chaos of formation, flight, or the chaos of battle, every man carried the weight of something greater than orders. They carried memory, hope, the unbearable responsibility of coming back, or not, and the Thunderbolt became their confidant in that burden. It became their shield when enemy shells shredded the air around them. It became their sword when they dived on trains or tanks, their guns roaring like a vengeful storm. It became their coffin when the worst happened, when the wings snapped or the engine was hit and the only way down was through fire. And it became, for those who returned, a ghost, one they would remember for the rest of their lives. Behind every Jug was a ground crew too, men who worked without sleep, in freezing rain or choking dust, to make sure those planes could fly again. They were unsung heroes who patched bullet holes with trembling fingers, who scrounged for parts when supplies ran low, who silently prayed each time one of their pilots taxied out toward an unknown sky. Some of them had never flown, would never fire a shot, but they knew the Jug like it was a living thing. They smelled its oil leaks before they saw them. They felt its mood in the way it responded to engine startup. And when a plane didn't return, it wasn't a machine they mourned. It was a friend and the boy who flew it. These were not just soldiers. These were people thrust into roles history demanded of them. And through them, the Thunderbolt became more than an aircraft. It became a symbol of sacrifice. Not just because it fought, but because of who it carried, and what they risked, and what they gave up. When veterans later walked through hangars decades later and stood beside a restored